Ladies and gentlemen, a very good evening to you. Welcome to this exclusive members event of the George C. Marshall Foundation, inaugurating our new and exciting Marshall Legacy Series, an innovative initiative that we believe will help showcase to the world the breadth and the depth of the collections here at the Foundation, and also promulgate and define the legacy of one of the greatest Americans of the 20th century, George C. Marshall. I welcome also representatives of NSA and NARA, who this afternoon provided insight and understanding into the significance of William Friedman and the field of cryptology. The NSA and the National Archives were instrumental in declassifying and releasing to us William Friedman's official papers. And with the addition of those official papers to the personal papers that he gave the Foundation, the Marshall Foundation now possesses the most complete, the most comprehensive set of Freedman materials in private hands anywhere in the world. It is a very great pleasure this evening to introduce Dr. Bill Sherman, who joins us from the United Kingdom, where he holds a professorship at the University of York and is currently head of research at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Dr. Sherman first visited the Foundation in 2008 to visit William Friedman's papers. Despite the significant effort involved in traveling to Lexington for research, Bill has continued to visit us frequently. Bill has also been instrumental in helping the Foundation share that remarkable story, the story of William Friedman. He participated in a number of videos to be found on our website and advised us on how to conserve and look after this collection, and in forging two additional partnerships with other institutions where more of the Friedman's work can be found. It was the Foundation's distinct privilege to loan several documents and objects to the Folger Shakespeare Library for its exhibition, Decoding the Renaissance, 500 Years of Codes and Ciphers, which Dr. Sherman curated. There is indeed no one more qualified to speak on this topic than Dr. Bill Sherman. Dr. Sherman.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be here to help you inaugurate this important series, and a pleasure to help you celebrate two momentous events today, both of them involving men like me named William, as it happens. First, you just heard, it was the official release of William Friedman's governmental papers by the National Security Agency here at the Marshall Library, which is already home to Friedman's personal archive. And it is also, as some of you may know, the 451st birthday of William Shakespeare. Now, I want to suggest that those two events and those two Williams are related. And the daunting task I'm setting myself in this lecture is to persuade you that without the search for secret codes in the works of Shakespeare, we might have lost the war in the Pacific. And I want to provide a basic introduction to the science of ciphers to boot. So a tall order for a short talk. Now, if I ask you who can help us to link Bletchley Park and the Bard, or take us from the Second World War back to the First Folio, we might enlist the help of Benedict Cumberbatch. Currently celebrating his successful role as the great codebreaker Alan Turing, and preparing for his upcoming role as Hamlet for this summer's sold-out season on the London stage. Sadly, we couldn't persuade him to make the trip to Lexington, although you can always persuade me. I love it here, I have to say. But there's no need for someone like Benedict Cumberbatch, because you've already got someone here who is much better suited to the job. Enter William Friedman, chief cryptanalyst for the US government from the 1920s to the 1950s, and notorious multitasker. As leader of the team that broke the Japanese code in World War II, co-inventor of the US military's most secure cipher machine, author of many of the field's foundational papers, and creator of many of its key terms and institutions, Friedman is generally considered to be the most important maker and breaker of codes in modern history. His wife, Elizabeth, shared her husband's occupations and obsessions, serving as an important code breaker in her own right and co-authoring some of his most important publications. Now, the couple met each other over Renaissance ciphers as young postgraduates and never lost their admiration for the Renaissance thinkers who founded their field, the uncanny ability to see more than meets the eye, their clear-headed and good-humored approach to the often murky business of code breaking, and their commitment to solving mysteries, whether they be on the battlefield, in the courtroom, or in the library. They found their cryptographic calling and each other exactly 100 years ago in the most unlikely of places and in some very strange company. They met at a place called Riverbank Laboratories, and that is the founder of Riverbank there on the left, Colonel George Fabian, who wasn't a colonel. He was lots of things, larger than life figure, very, very wealthy textile merchant in Chicago who founded what is probably best described as a Baconian think tank on the banks of the Fox River in Geneva, Illinois, about 45 minutes west of Chicago. He was interested, as Francis Bacon was, in wresting the secrets of nature. That was what he said he was trying to do. Some of it was acoustics research, some of it was agricultural research, but ultimately he settled on what he thought was the great research problem of the early 20th century, and that was who wrote the plays of William Shakespeare. He employed someone named Elizabeth Wells Gallup, who was the leading advocate of the theory that Francis Bacon had written the plays of Shakespeare. And the method she chose was that of looking for ciphers in Shakespeare's works, because Bacon had, of course, written the first account in English of how ciphers worked. So she simply looked for the system that Bacon had described in the works of Shakespeare and thought she had found the answer. Now, Freedman joined this group as head of a department of genetics because he had an MA in plant genetics from Cornell and had started a PhD and decided to come west to work on this new problem of propagating plants in they were very interested in particular in nighttime circumstances and in manipulation of seeds and that kind of thing. So he worked in the plant genetics department. He was head of it, but he was the only member, so it wasn't hard to be head. And very quickly got more interested in ciphers, partly because he was able to use his interests in photography, very early but very keen amateur photographer, and increasingly interested in Elizabeth Friedman, Elizabeth Smith at that point, who, as you can see, was right above the figure of Elizabeth Wells Gallup in the middle. She's that sort of fond, arching figure right over her head. So they worked together. Now that group quickly came to represent the country's greatest concentration of civilian expertise on encryption and decryption at a time when the government did not yet have a central agency devoted to the making and breaking of codes. So odd as it now sounds, Gallup's team of Baconian code breakers were given the responsibility first of working on intercepted coded transmissions that took the US ever closer to involvement in World War I, and then when their entry became inevitable, the training of officers heading off to serve in France. And that takes us to what is my favorite single thing in the Marshall Foundation, and I think William Friedman's favorite example of how codes and ciphers work. Now this is the graduation photo from the crash course in military cryptography designed by William Friedman and delivered at the nearby Aurora Hotel in the early weeks of 1918. Now, when Friedman looked at this photo, and he did at least once every single day of his working life, because every photo of him at work shows this image clearly underneath the glass on his office desk. And he had a second copy made on a much larger scale and framed for the wall of his office. And that is what survives here at the Marshall Library. Now, this photograph, when he looked at it, why did he find it so significant? What did he see? Well, he saw his younger self at one end of the mysterious group of black-clad civilians seated in the center, and at the other end, he saw the formidable figure of George Fabian, his patron and boss. He also saw his wife, Elizabeth, who sits in the middle, flanked by two other instructors from Riverbank's Department of Ciphers. But most important of all, he saw a coded message hiding in plain sight. As a note on the back of the framed photograph explains, this image is a cryptogram in which people stand in for letters. And thanks to Friedman's careful positioning, they spell out the letters of Bacon's most famous axiom, knowledge is power. So these people are letters spelling out knowledge is power, or rather they almost do, because they're 4 people short for the number needed for that final R. So in fact, it says knowledge is pow. Now, knowledge is power, I think, became the Friedman's mantra and motto, and I think it's an important part of assessing a Marshall legacy. I think for the 20th century and 21st century, that Renaissance axiom, knowledge is power, has taken on new life, and in fact, new power. You know, obviously, the gathering together of information is what makes you prepared. Preventing other people from having that information is what gives you that advantage. Now, the Friedmans had that commitment to it to the point where not only is it their first lesson, but they had it inscribed on the tombstone that they designed for themselves for Arlington National Cemetery. So if you visit them today, you find their names, their dates, and knowledge is power, and that's it. It also remained Friedman's most cherished example of how using the science of codes, it's possible to make anything signify anything. Now that idea will strike us as quintessentially modern, maybe even postmodern, but Friedman took it straight, indeed verbatim, from the great Renaissance scholar-statesman, Sir Francis Bacon, along with both the encrypted axiom in the message and the cryptographic system used to convey it. So in other words, this graduation photo from the US military's earliest course in the making and breaking of codes is at once a tribute to Bacon's political philosophy and a masterclass in the use of his so-called biliteral cipher. Now, Bacon is credited not just with the first printed account of ciphers in English, but with laying the foundations for the most powerful code in history. He first discussed ciphers in general in this famous text on the advancement of learning, published in 1605. And in the expanded version of the text, he gives you a little bit more detail about how you should make ciphers that are particularly good or powerful. He says there are lots of different kinds of ciphers. Simple ciphers, ciphers where there are nulls or nonsense or meaningless figures intermixed with them, real ciphers, key ciphers, ciphers of words, etc. But he says there are 3 chief things that make ciphers good or powerful. They should be ready and not laborious to write. In other words, you shouldn't have to struggle to write them because you'll often be doing so under pressure. And so the easier they are to remember and produce, the better and more effective the system will be. The second is that they should be sure and lie not open to deciphering. In other words, they should be secure. It seems pretty basic. But third, and most important for him, is that they should, if possible, be managed without suspicion. In other words, if you can do it in a way so that it doesn't look like it's a cipher, all the better, because then there won't even be the desire to break the code because people won't even know there's a code there in the first place. So those are the 3 goals. Well, the system he developed is, on one hand, incredibly simple. All it is a substitution alphabet where you take only 2 letters of the alphabet for your replacements. So instead of, you know, the classic sort of Caesar substitution alphabet would be where you take one entire alphabet and another entire alphabet and replace the same letter with another letter all the time by shifting the alphabet along or by garbling the second alphabet. You know, that's your basic substitution. Well, he wanted to do it with only 2 letters which is why it's called biliteral. It's not bilateral as in sides, but biliteral. So only A's and B's. Now to do that, you need 5 letters for every one of your encryptions. So the plain text message that you're encoding is replaced by 5 letters for each one letter. And they are combinations of A's and B's in the way you see here. So the letter A is always replaced by A, and Z by B, A, B, B, B. And you can see the rest of the alphabet. Now, if that's how you did it, if you just said, you know, for the word high, A, B, A, B, B, A, B, sorry, A, A, B, 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 A, B, A, it would be pretty easy to break and it would look like a code. So the key thing here, the incredibly powerful thing that he came up with, which is why he said this is the most powerful method in history, he suggested, is that because this code can signify anything by means of anything. And the way you can do that is by replacing A's and B's with anything that can be broken into A or B, or an A type or a B type. It can be pluses and minuses. It can be colors, black and white. It can be literally apples and oranges. So you could have orange, orange, apple, 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 and then you've got H. You could have minor key and major key in music. Anything that can be broken into 2 can spell an alphabet. That is a phenomenally powerful tool, and it is the tool by which literally anything can signify anything. So that's about as powerful as it gets. Well, takes us back to this little device, which was the one that Friedman devised as his graduation photo / lesson in Baconian biliteral ciphering. And the way you get to knowledge is power, you can see there, is that, can anybody tell what it is? Can anybody see what the A versus B is? What's the trigger? What's the distinction? Exactly, where they're looking. So he simply told people, you A types look at the camera, you B types look away from the camera. The problem down there in the middle above him, somebody that this B guy here went a little overboard, and so you can see that something funny is going on, but in general, it's ingenious. And Friedman liked it so much, as I said, that it was the first thing he used to tell people about how ciphers worked. It's his favorite example. Now, he did another example a little earlier, which I think captures even more his astonishingly rapid transition from genetics to cryptology and from literary to military codes, and reveals an intuitive grasp of cipher systems and an ability to work and play with them that must have been breathtaking at the time. And it's this, and I only found this recently. The one on the left is a small postcard that the Gallup team, the Baconian Cipher team at Riverbank, used for their internal correspondence. It was designed by Friedman. It says on the bottom, copyright 1916, W.F. Friedman. This is only a couple months after he arrives at Riverbank, so very, very early days. And then WFF in the lower right corner is his initials. And he calls this, as again, thinking as a plant genetics student, Cipher baconis Gallup, a most interesting and peculiar plant propagated at the Riverbank Research Laboratories. So that in itself is clever, nice joke. Well, the poster-sized version on the right, which turned up only recently at the New York Public Library, was the one he used for teaching and showing that every single mark on the page on the left is a code for something else. And as you can see, he added that telltale caption at the top, an example of making anything signify anything by the biliteral cipher invented by Francis Bacon. And again, he gives you the code, the alphabetical key, and then he shows you how it works with 2 different root systems, 2 different patterns on the leaves, and in the flowers on the top, there's a notched versus an unnotched petal. That's the system of A's and B's. And the point is that the root system spells Bacon and the flower spells Shakespeare. Just brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Now, over the next few years, the Freedmans turned from reading to writing and from literary code hunting to military code breaking, producing the series of pamphlets known collectively as the Riverbank publications, leading up to the final item in the series, the Index of Coincidence, generally considered to be the most important publication in the history of the field. How did the Freedmans and this field move so quickly from Baconian cipher hunting to the kind of systematic, institutionalized cryptography that would change the face of the 20th century? From the way wars are waged to debates over information security in a post-Snowden age. Now, what surprised me most in my research on codes and ciphers is that Friedman's quintessentially modern achievement, and I would say it is one of the great achievements of modernity, laying these foundations for GCHQ and NSA, was inspired by and grounded in Renaissance texts and technologies. So if this is the great modern cryptographic book, he was absolutely consciously drawing on and reinventing the early cryptographic book, the first cryptographic books. And here you see the first two treatises on the subject in the West. The one on the left is published in 1586, but the first known treatise written in about 1467 by the great quintessential Renaissance man, Alberti, Leon Battista Alberti, his treatise on ciphers. And then on the right, the full book, which gets the title of the first full printed text on the subject in the West, 1518 book by Johannes Trithemius called Polygraphiae. So he's absolutely indoctrinated in Renaissance cryptography because Gallup and Fabian, in equipping the Freedmans and their colleagues for their Baconian mission, gave them a deep, deep grounding in the rare books from this field, which are now all part of the Fabian collection at the Library of Congress, which he gave to them in the 1930s. So as they moved into their governmental careers, the Freedmans never forgot the lessons that they learned from Alberti, Trithemius, Bacon, and their contemporaries. So most of what they went on to develop had one foot in the Renaissance and one foot in the 20th century. Now, the story doesn't, of course, start with either the Renaissance or the printing press. Cryptography is mentioned in the Bible, and it plays a key role in handwritten communications between networks of traders or ambassadors. Now, by the Middle Ages, courtly communications and diplomatic networks draw very heavily on basic cipher systems, generally known as nomenclators. And this is a nice typical example from a diplomatic mission of somebody in the Low Countries in 1588, from somebody with quite a significant name in the history of libraries, Thomas Bodley, the founder of Oxford University's great Bodleian Library. So Bodley had an ambassadorial career, and in this particular mission, this was the code he was to use and correspond with others who had the same code, obviously. And this is a very typical arrangement where every letter is replaced with an arbitrary symbol. There are 3 nulls, as you can see over there, so 3 characters to throw in and throw people off the trail that don't mean anything. And then for words that are used often, place names, particular people, you get your own special cipher, your own special mark. Very common, arbitrary, but really easily broken if you use it for very long. So not all that useful. But these things are used all through the Renaissance period. In the English Civil War, they came into their own very much, and a huge amount of correspondence between military figures in the English Civil War in the 1640s and 50s used systems like this. And again, here's a typical letter where you can see sensitive material switching into a numerical code, a substitution code. And at the top, you can see how it works. Individual letters are replaced by numbers. In some cases, whole words like army, horse, quarters, rebels, etc. And you can see how that works. Very easy to break because somebody broke it and deciphered it in the middle between every line. So we can now see how that system works. But one of the interesting things that I've been finding in the research on this is that it isn't just military situations where this kind of code is developed and deployed. And what really surprised me, now this is a disappointing slide because the image didn't come through. It's so secret, I can't even show you. No, I'm kidding, it just didn't come through. But this is in the 1640s and 50s. a nobleman named Henry Oxenden developed his own cipher system, which was pretty complex, to correspond with his wife. Now, they lived together. Why would you have your own code to correspond with your wife? Well, funnily enough, that's something that runs through history. And this is actually a very early letter by the great Irish poet William Butler Yeats. So W.B. Yeats developed a code to correspond with his sister, and this is when he's 11. The Freedmens famously had all sorts of codes for their own domestic entertainment, and in this case, this is one of many menus which involved cryptographic tricks and puzzles, and they had what they called the Café Cryptanalytique at their house. And you would have to solve these, as we heard from Rosemary earlier, you would have to solve these puzzles to move on to the next course. So one of the things that this teaches me is, of course, history repeats itself, one of the great lessons. But another important thing is that we tend to think about code breaking as preventing communication or interrupting a line of communication. In fact, it's often about enhancing or building a line of communication between those who you let in on the secret. And so I think that's a very important thing when we think of the Freedmens as partners in code, as the exhibition out in the hall right outside that door. There's a special bond between those partners who share that code. That can be a prince and his employee. It can be a husband and a wife. And I think that's something that's worth remembering about code breaking and code making. It's not just about preventing codes, it's also about cementing special relationships. Now, as the science of secret communications is revived and expanded in the Renaissance, the field generally breaks down into two different approaches, and it's confusing because they both mean the same thing. Cryptography, which we've all heard, hidden writing, secret writing, and the word steganography, which may not be as familiar to you and means the same thing, hidden or secret writing. But actually the basic distinction, as you can see, is that in cryptography, you tend to take a message and garble it. You can rearrange the letters, you can substitute those letters with other characters, etc. So the message itself is changed. In steganography, the message tends to stay the same, but it tends to be covered by something which hides it. It's an innocent cover. So here's a really good example, maybe the clearest example of a form of steganography, which really comes into its own in the Renaissance period, which is called the grill, G-R-I-L-L-E. It's associated with the great Renaissance mathematician Girolamo Cardano. He was probably better known as the person who figured out how to cheat in gambling, but he also figured out a lot of tricks for secret communication. And you can see on the left, he designs this sort of stencil where you cut out parts of a page, you write inside those gaps your real message, and then you lift the stencil off, write the rest of the text in a misleading or innocent cover, and then you send the message to someone who shares the same stencil. They put the stencil over the page and the real message is revealed. It's very simple. That one's from 1634, sent from Dublin to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Very interesting example. Well, the Freedmens revive this in typically witty form. Somehow, in the middle of all of his other duties, Friedman often seems to have found time to generate things like Christmas cards, which are ingenious. This is maybe the most powerful. This was sent to the Freedmen's family friends in 1928 as their Christmas and New Year greeting card. And what they did, it was a telegram which came with a separate grill, this little red thing on the right with the holes cut in it. So just using that little matrix of letters, which you couldn't really pick out much from, if you put the grill over it, it starts to reveal not only a message, but a rhyming poem. And so it says, for Christmas greetings in 28, and then you turn the grill 90 degrees and you get, we use a means quite up to date. You turn it another and you get a crypto telephotogram here, brings you word of Xmas cheer, which is fairly impressive. Here's another example that the Freedmens used and shuttled between Renaissance technology and modern applications. A very famous late 17th century German cryptography book showed how you could use a flower cipher. So individual flowers could stand in for letters of the alphabet. So an entire wreath or bouquet could be an alphabetical message in hiding, right? You can see. So this wreath actually spells out in German, "I will be true to you or faithful to you unto death." Well, the Freedmans and their colleagues at Riverbank realized that the very new, at that point, only 2-year-old trade slogan of the Florists Association was say it with flowers. And it still is, I think. I think that's the official Florists Association trade slogan. So they said, oh, you know, you actually can say it with flowers. Say it in cipher with flowers, a flower cipher. So they published in the trade journal of the Florists Association an article called Saying It in Cipher, about how to encode messages. I'm not sure anyone ever did, but there you go. They had fun. And a final example, using music. This is another very famous 17th century overview of the field of secret communication by Bishop John Wilkins, a book called Mercury, or the Swift and Speedy Messenger, 1641. He has this pair of images to show you how letters on staves can give you a match to an alphabet. So you can assign a musical note to a letter of the alphabet. And the point is at the bottom then, by playing a melody, you are playing a message. You are actually saying something with sound. And at the bottom, he says, amazingly enough, two musicians may discourse with one another by playing upon their instruments of music, as well as by talking with their instruments of speech. So two people playing melodies to each other could be a conversation, as well as a harmony. Now, this example is one which the Freedmans, yes, again played with, to take the state song of Kentucky, My Old Kentucky Home Good Night, and to turn this into another example of making anything signify anything. And here it's another A's and B's Baconian biliteral cipher. And this is where, in this case, you probably can't see it, it's a little bit blurry, but if there's a gap in the note, if it looks like there's a little hole missing in the stem of a note, that's the B type. And if it's a whole note, then it's A type. And if you go through and do all the A and B translation, you get enemy advancing right, we march at daybreak. This is absolutely brilliant. So this is an example which is both a substitution cipher, right, and steganography. It's the ultimate, it's what's going on. But going forward, the real breakthroughs came with mechanization. And so mechanizing gave people the ability to transcribe accurately, to do it quickly, and above all, to do it securely. Now, these are very familiar examples. The two great names in the history of tabular mechanization, Trithemius in the very first book has this very powerful table. And this is an extraordinary breakthrough. It may look like a bunch of alphabets, but actually that's what it is. It gives you access to every alphabet all at once. And so you can code by moving down between alphabets. So instead of being stuck with only one thing replacing one thing, you suddenly can move even every letter of your encryption to a different alphabet. And as long as your recipient knows the system by which you're doing that, they can recover your plain text. Now that is a very powerful breakthrough. Vigenère, 1586, often described as the undecipherable cipher because of that. And it really, in that period, was almost impossible to break. But what I want to focus on in this final couple of examples is not the tabular version of this, but the circular version of this, because you can do the same thing with a disk or a rotor, sometimes put together in this way. You can see on the left, this comes straight from, again, the very first treatise in the West. Alberti of Ciphers has this extraordinary passage on how you can use two wheels, one of which is stable and the other of which moves, in order to create different correspondences of the alphabet. Okay, so with Alberti, and then the next great breakthrough was Silvestri, you get this multiple alphabets, but you get encryption in a form that is mechanical and portable, handheld, literally. This really runs through then the history of cryptography, and a lot of the great cryptographic books feature these what are called volvels. They're fixed printed plates with tacked in movable wheels, which usually have a pointer of some kind or another, and that's giving you this mechanized device to move through the whole alphabet. That then gets developed in the 1660s by a popular scientist named Samuel Moreland into a handheld device. Now, the one on the right, he patented really in the same year a cryptographic machine, which he described in a book on the left, but does not survive, and an adding machine, which is the one that you see on the right. Well, they're clearly the same technology, and it basically uses moving wheels, on the left alphabetical and on the right numeric, and you can have this little thimble or a kind of a handheld stylus that moves them around. So Moreland is the next great one. Well, in the early 20th century, these are still very much in use, and the Freedmans had what must have been the best collection of rotors and cipher disks, and played on it in various forms as they studied their craft. Played literally in one case, because one of their earliest things in the field is this game that William Friedman invented and tried to patent with Parker Brothers, who said that they thought it might be too hard for young kids to figure out how this worked, but it was the classic cipher wheel, and he called it the Cryptor. And as you can see, it says patent applied for the game of secrecy. But more importantly, much more importantly, it formed the basis ultimately for this fantastic device invented by Friedman and Frank Rowlett, called in one form the Cigaba. And the Cigaba is an incredibly complicated series of rotors, up to 15, with very complicated stepping mechanisms. And that is the thing that he is probably to be thanked for as much as the breaking of the Japanese code, or the leading of the team that broke the Japanese code. Now that, of course, is the much more famous version of a rotor machine, the Enigma machine. But of course, this one you know about because it was broken. The other one, the Cigaba, you don't, because it wasn't. And so it was not really public until something like 70 years after it was first invented. So an extraordinarily long-lived and powerful device, just to show you. Now, this obviously takes us up to the cusp of the computer age. And of course, Alan Turing famously applied very early computer technology to the breaking of this kind of machine. But I think you can see the computers all the way along, all the way coming through Samuel Moreland, and even all the way back to Alberti. And so not surprisingly, it was Friedman himself who spotted this. Now, his career was right at the end of the pre-computer age, but he said in his very, very late final lectures on the history of cryptology around 1959, that binary code of Francis Bacon, the A's and the B's, or substitute zeros and ones for A's and B's, and you have the first binary code. And he said, therefore, Bacon was the inventor of the binary code that forms the basis of modern electronic digital computers. Now, as their government careers wound down, the Freedmans returned to the Baconian cryptographic project that gave them their start. So by the 50s, Gallup's theory had really lost all credibility and given way to many others, and had spawned countless books offering decodings of the works attributed to Shakespeare that were ever more elaborate, and in the Freedmen's eyes, never entirely plausible. So in 1954, they finished a remarkable study of Gallup and her fellow Baconians, published in 1957 as the Shakespearean Ciphers Examined, and it almost single-handedly put an end to the craze for amateur anti-Shakespearean cryptography. The original study, though, as you can see, had a very different title. The Cryptologist Looks at Shakespeare, and it was written and typed on government stationery, funnily enough. In 1954, it was deposited at the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C., where it won the first and only annual book prize. And it was then bequeathed with their entire collection of Shakespeareana to the library that was only 2 blocks from their final home on Capitol Hill. Now that home and that resting place of their archive, the Folger Shakespeare Library, is where a few months ago we launched an exhibition featuring both the Renaissance influences and their outlets in the Freedmen's work called Decoding the Renaissance, 500 Years of Codes and Ciphers. And we are now taking this up to date here at the George Marshall Foundation with another exhibition, Partners in Code, William and Elizabeth Freedmen. And I hope you'll all get a chance to look at it. So there you have it, a life or lives in code, quintessentially modern, yet beginning and ending in the Renaissance, deeply American, yet fundamentally connected to British history and literature. Now, whether or not I have persuaded you that Shakespeare helped us to win the war, I hope this story has provided a basic introduction to the long history of cryptography and some of the basic terms and techniques through which it evolved from medieval manuscripts to modern computers. I hope it will show how important it is to understand history when we're facing the pressing problems of the present, something Marshall himself spoke about, and also how important it is to combine the sciences and the humanities in tackling anything as complex as a code. Now, finally, in an era obsessed with career planning, I hope you'll also take comfort in the fact that a Russian immigrant who started his career as a photographic assistant on a project trying to prove that Bacon wrote Shakespeare's plays ended up helping to win World War II. And I think that's, in a way, the most comforting thing is follow your heart and follow your nose, and you never quite know where it'll take you, because when anything can signify anything, you never know where the signs are going to take you. So leave it there. We have time for a few questions before we head out. Sure.
Who invented our alphabet and when?
Oh gosh, that's a big question. But it really probably goes back to Phoenicians and then evolves all the way through. Now, one of the things that I wish I could have shown you is this series of alphabetical books in the Renaissance, because there were lots of books on the history of the alphabet in the Renaissance. And each of those, particularly exotic alphabets or obsolete alphabets, provided people with a ready cipher system, because you could simply substitute the current one with an old one or a foreign one. And a lot of people actually did use foreign alphabets as ciphers. And for that reason, and the fact that, as Friedman said, really alphabets are the weapon here. Letters are the weapon. He said that, I don't have the exact phrase, but he said that the most powerful weapon ever invented was the alphabet. And I think that, you put your finger right on it. The other thing that's interesting, I mean, another example that I could have shown, Renaissance cipher systems often evolved from shorthand. There was a very important development in the period. Again, if you think about writing being both fast and secure, those are the two things that you're after. Well, shorthand really does both at once. And especially given that it was still a fairly rare skill, a fairly specialized skill, a secretary, a keeper of secrets, is able to use shorthand in a way that was both able to keep up with speech and to keep most prying eyes out. So that's another interesting development. Anything else? Yeah, Eric.
You mentioned this afternoon that a challenge of writing about Friedman is that he's a polymath.
Right.
And it struck me for the first time that your first book was about a Renaissance man of the Renaissance.
Yep.
But also that he worked for the government.
Yep.
I wonder if you talk about writing about Dee and writing about Friedman.
Yeah, so my PhD and first book were on a guy named John Dee, D-E-E. And Dee is very famous for being a kind of wizard, a kind of Merlin figure at Queen Elizabeth's court. I worked on him and tried to say, actually, sure, he was interested in magic, but he was interested in everything else. and he was interested in the magic of knowledge. And so he tried to acquire as much information that could be useful to employers as possible. And in a lot of cases, increasingly, it was governmental employers. And so sometimes it was things like astrology, trying to help. He literally advised the queen what the best day for her coronation was using astrology. But he also really combed the history of English chronicles and history books to find the history of the term empire or imperium. And so he was the coiner of the phrase British Empire, and ultimately argued that Queen Elizabeth could be claiming a lot more of the land around the world, which of course she and her successors, especially Victoria, would go on to do. And so I think that's what I would say, is there's this lack of, again, if there's a lesson here, in part, it's that the lack of disciplinary boundaries, the lack of disciplinary specialism often opens up new possibilities. That poses challenges for us. I mean, the big challenge with Dee was not only the number of topics that he covered, but that his library included 24 languages, all of which he seems to have used and worked with. And I had one pretty well, two if you count English and British English. And I was, that's the challenge. And so teamwork is the other answer. Interdisciplinary work and teamwork, I think, goes a long way. But secrecy is in many ways what it's all about. Yeah, good question. Any other? Yeah.
Can you tell me how the substitution code using a book or document works?
So there are a lot of different examples of this. My favorite example is in Graham Greene's Our Man in Havana, where quite a lot of the plot turns on a particular book code. The idea is simply that two people you're sharing the same key. And in this case, the key is a previously printed book. And if you've got that, you can produce a numerical code, say, which is page number, line number, position in line, right? So it would be a series of numbers which would be meaningless to anyone who didn't have the actual book that it was based on. But if you did, you could just go straight to chapter and verse and you'd find it. And so that's it. It's that simple. As long as you agree, the dangerous part is how you and your recipient agree on the book and keeping that secret. From then on, it's easy. Unless you pick a really obvious book, which is the other problem. And in the Renaissance, there weren't that many books around, particularly in private hands. I mean, Dee's library had 4,000 books, which at that point was absolutely unheard of. Most households would have had a Bible and not much more than that. And so the book code in that form really doesn't come around until 18th, 19th century, when many people have more of these books around. But yeah, that's another very simple one that a lot of us have learned from growing up. Yeah.
Dr. Phil Sherman, thank you very much.
It's a pleasure, Rob.
We have a very small token of our esteem. Thank you so much.
That's brilliant. I showed that image and now I've got it. I wish that always happened. I'm going to show some very rare and interesting. I'll show the Mona Lisa next time.
We will do our best.
Yeah. Thank you, Rob. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, pleasure.
I've had the honor and the distinct pleasure of being president of the Marshall Foundation for nearly a year, nearly 12 months. And it struck me over the course of that time that the Marshall Foundation is akin to an iceberg. There is a lot more beneath the surface. And the Freedman collection is a great example of that, is emblematic of that. But just as the Marshall Foundation itself has so much more to show and tell, so George C. Marshall, the man, is akin to an iceberg. People today know his name. They know the Marshall Plan. But the depth, the substance, the full spectrum of what he did, how he did it, and the significance of it is being lost. The Marshall Foundation will reverse that trend. That's our aim. The Legacy series is the beginning of one of the first ways we will begin to do that. You, as friends of the foundation, are responsible for events like this. You make it happen. Thank you for that support. We need it today, we'll need it tomorrow. Encourage your friends to support us. But thank you. This was a great kickoff. We look forward to more events of this ilk, revealing that iceberg, the iceberg of the foundation and Marshall, that great man of the 20th century. You will receive shortly in the mail the next iteration of this opening of the Legacy series. On the 20th of May, a discussion and a showing of our Enigma machine. You can see it in the exhibition out there, and a lecture by our archivist and assistant librarian, Jeffrey Kozak. Following that, a showing of the movie you saw referenced, The Imitation Game. So thank you for being here tonight. Please look at the exhibition out there. It is a wonderful exposition, as I said, of all we have here. And join us for a reception with Dr. Sherman and some of our other guests in the museum upstairs. Thank you for coming.